Everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Debrief here on FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, joined in studio by Ted Baker. He is the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. What a week it has been. It's Friday, the weekend is here, and today's episode we are digging into local rural issues. Rural is the focus today because it seems like every single story we've been talking about throughout the week or writing has had some sort of rural flair to it. So with that being said, we're going to kick the show off with some questions from listeners. But first, a couple quick housekeeping items that I just got to get out of the way here off the top. Sam Goodman was on FLX Weekly this week. She is now part of the news team. She is covering some of the more fun stuff, the lifestyle stuff, the stuff that Ted and I don't enjoy as much, obviously, because we're jaded old reporters. We also have a new intern coming on for the summer. You'll be seeing more from both of them in the coming weeks. Inside the FLX is making its return next week. It's going to be live every Monday at 11 a.m. And then Sunday Conversations are also coming back for the summer and fall. Obviously, this is all a big push because we have elections coming up, and election season never ends, despite the fact that I managed to go a couple months without talking about an election. Petitions have been circulating. We have had caucuses taking place, all sorts of political stuff still happening. So now that that's out of the way, let's get into some of these questions. We're going to start this off with one from Geneva. Matt D. wrote us asking about city council meeting that happened this week. And obviously we haven't published the story yet, but you guys over at Finger Lakes Daily News have already published a couple stories. It was a marathon meeting, five hours and change as usual. But Matt writes us and says, this week's Geneva City Council meeting stream was loaded with technical issues. How can local officials be held accountable for this kind of failure, and should there be consequences? And it's interesting because we've touched on it a little bit, I think, a couple different times. But obviously, this whole push to streaming meetings is fairly new, not for Geneva, but fairly new in the sense that more people are watching now since the pandemic happened. It was the primary way that folks consumed, watched, was able to participate in a lot of these meetings because they were being live streamed. It's also interesting, I think, because the state has put a little more emphasis on governing bodies of different kinds, like IDAs, to stream their meetings so that people can participate. That said, there isn't really any check and balance or consequence for if there is, as was the case this past week, a audio failure, which was the case. About an hour or so of audio was more or less intelligible. You couldn't really make any of it out. It was scrabbled. The voices were kind of like pounding over each other. So what are you thinking when you hear this? And obviously this is probably an issue we're going to see more of as time goes on. Do you think there kind of needs to be a system that addresses that and ensures that, parts of meetings, especially if something consequential is happening, doesn't get lost?
Well, if your email writer is talking about, consequences in the law or violations, if that happens, I don't think we need to go there. I mean, technical things are always going to happen. I just think as a practical point, the city should have somebody sitting in the next room with a laptop monitoring the feed. And if there's something wrong, go in and figure it out. I don't know what the nature of the problem was. I mean, there's, as we know, all kinds of things that can go wrong in any kind of technical enterprise. So, but I mean, there should be somebody watching it, I think,
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, at least when I think about it, it's one of those, thankfully it wasn't anything significant that was missed. It was kind of like reading of reports and things like that wound up happening. But The flip side of it is it opens the door for folks to question what's happening at these meetings or the intentions of different elected folks. So it seems like there should be at least a process, and I don't know that it doesn't need to be a law. I agree with that. But I do think that cities, towns, villages, whatever the case may be, if they're going to the length to stream a meeting so that people can participate or to increase access, then they should also have essentially a clause in their own policies where if something goes wrong, they hit the pause button and they don't do anything during that span when things are mumbled or scrambled or whatever the case may be, just to prevent people from getting too upset about whatever could possibly happen.
I can understand that because in a sense, if we're going more to online and we're telling people that's the way they can follow the meeting, then having an audio failure is essentially the same as locking the doors and kicking the public out of the meeting. So, I mean, right. I would be in favor. I think that's a good idea to say, okay, we're having an audio problem. We're going to pause the meeting until we get it fixed. If there's any law to be passed, I would pass a law against 5-hour city council meetings.
And I would join you in supporting that law because, and it's interesting, I think some cities have gotten that right and they meet more frequently throughout the month to avoid these sort of marathon sessions, but it seems like no matter what Geneva does, they can't get out of the habit. They have these pre-meeting meetings that happen a few days before, but that didn't seem to have any effect on the length of the meetings. But
on the other hand, maybe it's a healthy sign because the other extreme is when the meetings last only a few minutes and some agenda item that really begs discussion gets almost none, leading you to believe that the actual discussion took place somewhere behind closed doors, 2 days before the meeting. So I guess there's kind of a balance to be struck there.
Well, and I'll say, having covered a lot of different county legislators and boards of supervisors, there's a pretty interesting split in the Finger Lakes here. You have Wayne County, which moves through Wayne County and Ontario County. Both boards there move through resolutions at breakneck speed. Jackie Augustine, who's been on the show a bunch of times, always complains about the fact that Ontario County does that grouping mechanism where they'll approve 30 resolutions at once. Advocates of that system say, look, the real debate, the real discussion happens as it's supposed to in committee. Problem with that is you do have an access issue when you have 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 committee meetings scattered throughout a 30-day month, and that becomes a big issue. Now, the flip side of that is you have Seneca County Board of Supervisors where, despite the fact that they do committee meetings at a different part of the month, the regular board meeting, often if there is something controversial, still winds up being fairly long. So it's kind of interesting and maybe more a reflection of the composition of these boards more than it is sort of a reflection of a process that either works or doesn't work. If you have a bunch of people who really have a core philosophical difference with how they view the governing body moving forward, then you might have more of these situations playing out. Another question coming in. Eleanor from Palmyra wrote us to say, recently saw you're hosting an interview with one of the candidates for Wayne County Sheriff. What happens if the other candidate does not participate? Should you still conduct an interview to maintain fairness? This one, I think we've talked about this before, honestly. This one has always been a little bit frustrating to me because of the openness that we provide. And it's similar to what you guys do in that I know your process well enough to know that you're giving airtime to anybody who's willing to, basically anyone who has an interest and is willing to participate in a discussion about a topic.
Yeah, I mean, we don't turn people down. So right. if someone in a race doesn't come on the air, it's because they didn't ask. Now, I don't reach out a whole lot because I just don't have staff and a whole lot of time. So most of the people who come on our show are there at their request. But yeah, there's nothing unfair if a particular candidate refuses to come on or simply doesn't reach out or doesn't answer when you reach out. There's no fairness issue that dictates that you then shouldn't have somebody else on.
Right. And I think part of the reason why this question came up was because I added an editor's note at the bottom of that story that effectively said, interview number 1 was scheduled very quickly. Candidate number 1 reached out very quickly after I sent out the initial messages. Candidate number 2, to date now a week later, we still haven't heard from them. So they will get equal airtime if they choose to take it. And
right.
That's really what it comes down to.
And that's all we can do, really.
Yeah, and I think it's also, if you want to talk about fairness, I don't think it's fair to the candidate or the individual who says, yes, I will participate, and is having that conversation with us as a media organization. I don't think it's fair to them to say, well, sorry, I can't interview you because other person doesn't want to participate. That doesn't strike me as fair either, so I don't really see the issue. I will say that there is clearly, this question proves it, there's an advantage to the individuals who participate in media events in general when they're running for office.
Well, and also we were talking about this before we went on the air, there's a big difference in media savvy levels between candidates. There are some candidates who kind of get it and understand what media coverage can do. There's others who really don't. I mean, if you're running for any kind of an office and you don't know who Finger Lakes News Radio is or how to get a hold of them, or you don't know who Finger Lakes One is or how to get a hold of them, then you're kind of handicapping yourself right from the start. I mean, that's, you're talking about Andrew Giuliani running for governor, and he stops in Soda's Point, and apparently nobody really knew. And the point of going to one of these events isn't so much to talk to the half a dozen people gathered at the cafe as it is to hope that cameras and microphones come, and then you get seen and heard by thousands of people.
Yeah, and I put this in the same category as the questions about bias in terms of our coverage, what we cover, what we don't cover. I hate to be the bearer of bad news for anybody who's listening or watching, but if there's something that doesn't get covered, odds are it's because we weren't notified that it was happening, or we weren't notified in a timely manner that it was happening. And that is always, those are, I think, the always two biggest issues.
Well,
I think
there's still a lingering misperception that we put our thumbs on the scales. I mean, for the most part, we really don't. We're fairly detached. I mean, I don't live in Geneva, so do I care which candidate wins for mayor of Geneva? Not particularly. So I'll speak to all of them. I'll treat them all fairly. I mean, there's this idea, because I think partly because of the rise of partisan media, there is certainly partisan media out there, and we know who they are. But I think there's that perception that if we interview candidate A and don't interview candidate B, it's proof that we want candidate A to win. And that just isn't the case. It's just not how we operate. We couldn't operate that way. I mean,
right.
if you and I, if we don't treat people equally and fairly, then nobody's going to want to come on and be interviewed, except for people who think that we support them.
Yeah, and to that end, what you're talking about, I think, is also a pretty good reflection of kind of where we stand right now in terms of media organizations effectively communicating, or not very effectively communicating, what our world looks like. The idea that we have a personal, I always sort of laugh at these conversations, these big think tank conversations, I guess you'd consider them, when folks in media will say, well, how can journalists not have feelings? How can journalists not care about issues? And yes, there are some issues that inevitably every human is going to care about. But the idea that we care enough about all of the things on a personal level, forget about the professional objective level in terms of us doing our jobs, a lot of journalists just are doing their jobs and going home and not really having deep, sort of powerful thoughts or opinions on a lot of things that we cover, just because of the speed at which the news cycle moves first, and also just given how high stress the job actually is, contrary to what people think. Like, covering the breadth of news that the average journalist winds up having to cover, even in just a single day, doesn't really leave you a lot of fuel in the tank to have a lot of personal views or thoughts after the fact.
Right. And if we wanted to be activists, we wouldn't get into this line of work to begin with. I mean, there's a lot better ways. If I wanted to advocate for particular positions, there are better ways for me to do it than hosting a morning talk show.
Yeah, and I'll also say this. Look, a few weeks ago I took a little flack for pointing out that I don't really want to hear from PR specialists anymore about their thing that they're basically advocating on behalf of. We semi-recently have instituted a pretty strict policy with only accepting quotes and things of that nature from folks who are actually a part of whatever the entity or thing is. We will not take blanket statements from PR specialists who are, sending something on behalf of an entity or organization without being able to attribute it specifically to a person. And the big reason for that is because you just don't know what you're getting. And if the journalists like us are able to sit back and say, look, if we can't properly vet this thing to really understand where it's coming from or what the hell it means, then I think that's a pretty big stamp of approval in terms of how objective journalists actually are.
Well, and some of those attempts to influence opinion are so ham-handed that they're pretty laughable anyway. We don't need somebody to tell us the virtues of business X or idea X. I mean, this is what we do for a living. We follow these things every day.
Yeah. So let's get into some of these topics. First up, a small community in Schuyler County is quite upset about the fact that Tompkins Trust is making an exit. We talked about this on your show this morning. Tompkins Trust says it came down to they're leaving the village of Odessa. Next nearest branch is in Montour Falls, about 17 miles away. Quite a drive, actually, if I Google mapped it, and it's actually not very convenient. The bank says it came down to a lack of foot traffic inside the branch and the shift in general to online banking, which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, really. But it's interesting because it seems like the feedback from local residents, their customers, and also village officials is that this bank, because it was literally the only bank in the village of Odessa, was getting pretty good foot traffic, or better than what I would assume most people would expect. Maybe it wasn't enough to Tompkins Trust's standards or what they expect foot traffic to be if they're going to keep a branch open. But the debate, I think, is kind of interesting. Is this a simple consequence of business or another example of a viability problem for really small rural communities like the village of Odessa?
I think there's a certain aspect to that, but I think in this specific case, I mean, banking is changing, obviously, like a lot of things. It was before the pandemic. I can't remember the last time I walked into my bank. My paycheck goes in with direct deposit. If I get any other kind of check, I deposit it with my phone. I snap a picture, click a button, and it's there. So I think fewer people need to go to banks. Also, one of the things that we've learned during this pandemic is a lot of the face-to-face routine contact we have doesn't necessarily have to happen. People have gotten used to Zoom. It's like I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, if I have 3 things I have to do, it's much nicer to sit in your living room with your laptop and do all 3 of them in a row on Zoom, as opposed to, I have to drive here and have this meeting, then I have to drive here and have this meeting. So I think that's a part of an aspect to it, is just the changes that the pandemic is going to bring that we always talk about. We like to do that long-term gaze at the crystal ball and see what the world's going to look like. So I think you're going to see, it may be the same thing with other businesses. Do we need to have insurance offices? Or if I need to meet with my insurance agent, can I just do it on Zoom? And can I email the documents or fax them over or whatever? So that's a certain aspect of it. But then there's certainly, we're going to see this in rural communities first, and it's going to create that divide that we've talked about. Services are going to be much more easily accessible to people in the more affluent parts of New York State.
Yeah, and I guess a couple things that stuck out to me with this story. I don't know that this is necessarily anything new. I think the writing's been on the wall since long before the pandemic that this was the direction at least this specific industry was going, but I think there's probably a dozen others you can point to as well, which does to me make it feel more like a viability problem for some of these really small communities. That said, I live, it's no secret, I live in the village of Webster, and it's funny, like we are, between 6 and 7 minutes away from the city of Rochester. But you know what? Like, I still have a drive to the bank. And frankly, I don't even use a bank that has a physical branch, to my knowledge, within a 50-mile radius of where I live. So, I think it's just sort of this natural progression that's happening. And I think, again, we talk about what these rural communities are made up of. And another topic that we're going to get to in a little while involves pharmacies and why their decline or independent pharmacies and why their decline is so meaningful in these rural communities. The populations are aging in these communities. And if we're talking about the group or the demographic that is least willing to transition from hand-to-hand banking, in-person banking, to remote banking, to online banking, whatever you want to call it, it is that group of people who is becoming the majority of a lot of these really small rural communities. And
they're also the least mobile population in many cases, so they're
right.
the ones most affected by having to drive 17 miles. There's definitely there's an age-based digital divide. I mean, there are 80-year-old people who are more savvy with technology than I am, but a lot aren't. I mean, so we take for granted, like you say, you've got a bank that doesn't even have a physical branch nearby. I rarely go into my physical bank anymore. I'm very comfortable snapping a picture of a check with my phone and pressing a couple of buttons. A lot of people are not. And I mean, that's going to be the future. I mean, that's kind of the you've got a topic later on about just state government in general and Andrew Cuomo, and it's people downstate are happy. Their economy is relatively thriving. I mean, pandemic considered, obviously, but it's coming back. And those wealthy downstate suburbs and the city itself don't have any of these kinds of issues that people have upstate. And that's why we have that constant divide between the downstate Democrats who, that famous story, and I don't remember who it was anymore, a few years ago, where somebody from downstate couldn't understand why we don't just take public transportation.
Right.
Because we don't have any.
Yeah.
There's no bus that stops at Rushville at 4:30 in the morning.
Well, right, and to that end, I kind of feel like it's like we're at a fork in the road, and there's two options of how this plays out over the next 10 or 15 years. One is the population start to age younger, and maybe the pandemic helps that happen with encouraging more people who live around cities currently move to more rural places because their jobs continue to be remote or whatever the case may be like that. Or the opposite side of that, or the other option, I guess, would be that it doesn't happen. And we have this, it seems like society in America right now is largely defined by the groups that are forgotten or the groups that are overlooked, whether you're talking about social injustice or racial injustice, whatever the case may be. Here we have another example of basically an age group that's been forgotten for the entirety of the tech boom, if you want to call it that. I mean, virtually everything has gone remote at this point. There is a non-physical option, non-in-person option for almost everything, whether it be mailing, whether it be shopping, whether it be even going to the bank. Your prescriptions can be dropped off at the house. I mean, everything has a technical option. And really, if you think about it, aside from the natural progression of tech in general, and it becoming more, I'll say, invasive and more in everyone's hand, there hasn't been any real concerted effort to ensure that this forgotten group or this demographic is accounted for, or I don't want to say transition, but brought into the fold so that they understand. The closest thing I think we see to that, or I use an example here, the Seneca Falls Library does these sort of like tech help events where they have teens helping seniors with their various smart devices. And I think they do it once a month or every couple months or something like that. But those events always have a really good turnout, and it's because a lot of folks don't have access to that knowledge base, and there hasn't been anything that's brought people forward or brought people
forward. I was thinking about this as you're talking. Maybe there's a chance for some sort of outside the box thinking. So Tompkins Trust, instead of completely pulling out of Odessa, maybe you have a part-time branch that's open a few days a week. Maybe you combine, instead of having your own bank branch, maybe the local bank and the local insurance agent and some other local business, maybe you combine and share a space. Mm-hmm. And maybe there's ways to do that. That's because it doesn't have to be an either or. It doesn't have to be, well, we have a bank that's open Monday through Friday 9 to 5, or we have none at all. Maybe you have one that's open 3 days a week part-time, or like I say, you share space. I mean, I think that's going to be one of the big things going forward is a decreased need for physical space for businesses. So maybe businesses combine together and you have sort of a little village business hub where you can go to the bank, go to your insurance agent, go to the laundromat. I mean, maybe there's a way to combine businesses into a smaller, slimmed down space and reduce those costs a little bit. So, I mean, these are some of the issues I think businesses are going to have to be looking at post-pandemic.
Yeah, and it's if you want a clean example of what you're describing is Monroe County DMV. They've essentially plopped a bunch of satellite locations around the county, and obviously a larger population there to deal with. But those satellite locations aren't open 5 days a week. They're open a couple days a week at most. And
right.
They have select hours, and it's by appointment. And, I think by and large it works. But again, I almost feel like we're too far along without having some sort of big seismic shift in terms of how we're actually getting this technology into people's hands in these rural communities, that outside the box thinking is necessarily going to save the day, because it's just we've moved so far away. Like it's ironic to me that the folks who want their in-person interactions, they want them at the same availability, I suppose, as everyone else gets their digital opportunities, right?
Right.
So, and that is, I think, the big issue is like conveying to people that, look, unlike 1975, when you could walk into a bank 7 days a week or 5 days a week or whatever it was in 1975, you'll only be able to do that once or twice a week. And if you want that experience, you're going to have to deal with the fact that there's only one or two options for you. And if you want that all the time experience, then you're going to have to move over to what is now the norm, which is digital.
Or, I mean, on the other hand, what if multiple banks combined and opened up a single branch that's staffed by Bank A on Monday and Bank B on Tuesday? I mean, money's money. It doesn't really,
frankly, that sounds way too rational to ever actually play out.
Well,
because that is one of the things I always laugh at. I laugh because, using the bank here on the corner in Seneca Falls that I used to belong to, before I switched, it had changed brand probably 3 times in a course of maybe like 6 years, and that was just sort of the, well, who cares what banner's flying on top?
Right. I mean, right down from the radio station was the Motel 6. It became a Days Inn, and I think the only difference was they put up a different sign.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really matter that much. So, I mean, those are some ways of thinking of things, but you're talking about the tech problem, and I mean, there was a story recently about the state's effort to roll out the low-cost internet for low-income people, and predictably all kinds of troubles. I mean, I think it was through Spectrum, and then it turns out that they wouldn't allow existing customers to switch to the cheaper plan. Other people trying to get the cheaper plan were told they weren't eligible. I mean, but what you said that really struck me is that we're so far along. I mean, these small villages are close to drying up and blowing away. So we haven't got a lot of time to turn this stuff around before a lot of these villages don't have any businesses left. I mean, we see them now. You go through these places that used to have maybe 8 or 10 or 12 downtown businesses, and today it's down to maybe 1, and maybe it's a pawn shop.
Yeah, and we see it in so many different industries. We've seen it in the grocery business is the one that I love to point
Yeah.
to. We see very few locally owned grocery stores, and where we do see them, they thrive because they have to go to such a great length to maintain their viability. They cannot just sort of mail it in and have their world continue to move forward. Another topic that's sort of in the same category here, same vein. Even after a pandemic, independent pharmacy owners were stuck rallying this week in Albany for a suite of bills that they say would improve long-term viability of their businesses. Why does this matter? Well, the data shows that a big chunk of the independent pharmacies that opened up over the last decade were forced to close during the pandemic. So a little more context there. Numbers show that over the last 10 years, the number of independent pharmacies had grown by 25%. Roughly, there were around 2,000 independent pharmacies, meaning your small town pharmacy. Relevant, obviously, because I can think of a handful of them throughout the Finger Lakes in small towns that don't have a CVS or don't have Rite Aid or whatever the big chains are. It's interesting because this is something that hasn't really gotten a lot of attention. This was actually, I think, the couple stories that I saw this week might have actually been the first that I had seen on the topic. I didn't even really know that this was an issue, but obviously, context, big picture, makes perfect sense. So should this be getting more attention since we are in the midst of a public health crisis, and if they can't survive now, when the hell can they survive? And these businesses are still struggling to maintain viability despite the circumstances. Converse to that, should we just accept that, some businesses, as you pointed out a couple weeks ago on this show, some businesses are just going to fail? And unfortunately, like everything else has been digitized, you can get your prescriptions mailed to you. But this seems to be a pretty significant problem for rural communities for a lot of the reasons that we just talked about. Aging populations, reliance on doctors and medications and that kind of thing. What's the split here, you think?
Well, I mean, ultimately, customers decide who stays in business or who doesn't. So if independent pharmacies are having trouble, that means customers are voting with their feet and with their dollars to go to the chain stores. But I mean, we had one that opened up in Rushville a couple of years ago. It lasted for about 6 months. They just couldn't make a go of it. Yeah. And I always talk about seeing the other person's point of view. I mean, those of us who have good, reliable cars, and, in my case, I live in Rushville, I work in Geneva 15 miles away, so I'm in Geneva all the time. So I don't need to have a lot of businesses in Rushville. It's many times more convenient for me to do my business in Geneva. But we just end up losing choice. I mean, it's, I like to go to Tops in Geneva. Now I don't have that option anymore. I used to go to Kmart in Geneva from time to time. I don't have that option anymore. I mean, if the little independent businesses close, then you've got the chain pharmacies across the street from each other that are indistinguishable pretty much other than their colors and their signs. I mean, it's the same products, the same everything. I just think that's ultimately we're going to miss having that choice where, okay, if they don't have it here, I can look at this store. Now it's, if they don't have it at Walmart, where am I going to go?
So I'm not saying this is a good thing, but to that end, a pharmacy is a pharmacy. I'm assuming they're mostly selling the same brands and the same generics and all that sort of thing. Playing devil's advocate, I'm sure someone's listening right now and says, well, who cares? What difference does it make? The local pharmacy is giving me just as good a amoxicillin as the chain pharmacy is. So what do I care?
And they usually can. I think that's one of the misperceptions, that the price is always going to be lower. But a lot of, there's all these discount apps and everything. Yeah. I mean, you can take advantage of that any place you go. So I don't think you're necessarily going to pay a higher price at a small independent for the same medication you'd get at Walmart or Wegmans or CVS or Rite Aid.
Yeah, and I think the one part of this that to me does feel a little like the scales are tipped in favor of the large corporations is that, like we talked about in a lot of business settings over the last 12 months, there isn't these little small mom and pop shops don't have the war chest, so to speak, that these large corporations do. Walgreens can handle 100 of its locations not making any money, finishing in the red, probably for years on end before they actually make a decision to close that branch or that location. The mom and pop shop doesn't have that opportunity. So that's one of the things where, at least from my point of view, if you're going to have, you've got two fork in the road again, you've got two options. You either have government getting involved in business and as you said, kind of decide who succeeds and who fails, or you just let the forces of capitalism and the market play out in real-time speed. If there is going to be interaction, I think that interaction needs to somehow try to find a way to balance that scale so that the small mom and pop shop can actually compete with the giant corporation. I'm not sure how you do that.
Well,
but that seems to be the only way to really effectively, prevent these small, in example of pharmacies, how can a small pharmacy in Lyons compete with, CVS and Walgreens?
Well, and it's hard. The biggest problem I think they face is that we've gone so far in the direction of one-stop shopping. I mean, when I was growing up as a kid in the 60s, you bought groceries at a grocery store, you bought hardware at the hardware store, you bought clothing at the clothing store, you gassed up and got your car worked on at a gas station. There was no such thing as a convenience store. There might be a corner market. So shopping was kind of a day-long thing where you'd make all these different stops. Now shopping is going to Walmart, and you get your drugs at Walmart, you get your clothes at Walmart, you get your groceries at Walmart. So if I'm already going to be at Walmart, why do I make this separate stop to my local pharmacy? To me, that's the biggest obstacle they face. It's like the pharmacy that opened up in Rushville was literally a 1-minute walk from my front door. But why do I make that 1-minute walk when I'm going to be in Walmart later today anyway, and I can do it there in one stop?
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because all of these topics that we're talking about are going to very drastically change the complexion of these small rural communities. And it doesn't necessarily stop with the business community, because we're going to talk about an environmental issue here in a second. But everybody keeps, I think a vast majority of people keep working off the assumption that, well, it's not going to happen soon, so don't worry. I think, like, to your point, there's not much left in a lot of these communities. They're mostly dried up. We are getting dangerously close to the point where these small rural communities just blow away and disappear.
Right. I mean, what's the point of living there when there's no restaurant you can go to, there's no drugstore you can go to, there's no corner market you can go to? If everything you need is now 17 miles away, then why don't I just move 17 miles away?
Yeah, and you talk about choice. I mean, you're really going to be pressing into an arena of no choice in 10 years when, villages like Odessa just don't have a reason to exist anymore. When, your small towns are forced to merge with the neighboring town.
Yeah.
To continue existing because the tax base isn't there or whatever the case may be. So this weekend there's going to be a rally over the Greenwich Generation Bitcoin operation on Seneca Lake. The rally is taking place at the DEC's Region 8 headquarters in Avon. This issue was sparked, or I should say this whole event was sparked by environmental advocates who are very concerned about Bitcoin mining on Seneca Lake, the impact of it. There's basically been this competing flow of information from environmental advocates as well as Greenwich itself, or I should say its PR agency, both, of course, painting themselves as not the villain. So this is not the first. We had the incinerator, the proposed incinerator, gas storage at the end of Seneca Lake. We've got the landfills. We've got all these environmental issues that keep coming up. The debate in my mind at this point is, does there need to be a new way for these advocates to go through the process of getting their message across? Why am I asking this? Well, because I can't help but wonder what difference this rally is actually going to make. If we know anything about the DEC, it's that they are almost deaf, right? They're understaffed. They do not hear what the community says. Frankly, I don't even think they care. They are working as a body. The governor has continued year after year, stripping more and more out of their budget, making them do more and more with what they have. Holding a rally at a regional office in Avon, of all places, to me doesn't seem like the most effective way to actually stop Bitcoin mining on Seneca Lake if you really want to see it stop. I don't know if that means going to Albany is any better. I'm not sure what rallies and walks and holding signs up actually achieves other than creating some media buzz, because what we've seen so far is absolutely no indication that Greenwich is going to be stopped. None whatsoever. They're growing. They're making no secret that they're growing. Their plan is to drastically increase their production along Seneca Lake, and they're sharing information with the public, whether you believe it or whether you think it's manipulated, that shows that they aren't having the impact on Seneca Lake that the environmental advocates say they are having. So how do you effectively combat that? I'm not sure this is the right way to go about it. I think the folks who are going out to Avon will be very disappointed in the long term at how this plays out. I could be wrong, and this could be the thing that puts a stop to them. But well, I don't see it happening.
I understand that the effort might seem futile, but if you don't make the effort, it's guaranteed to be futile. There have been cases around the country where people power has made a difference. So I think if you're an environmental advocate, you just have to believe, if I have this rally and get 10 people, maybe there'll be 20 at my next rally. Maybe there'll be some news stories about it. I mean, you have to keep pushing that boulder up the hill. And if you do long enough and hard enough, maybe it rolls over the other side and you get what you want. I mean, obviously the deck is stacked because all these companies have money and lawyers and public relations, and they know how to play the game. And unfortunately, a lot of your environmental groups are kind of, no offense, but kind of ragtag bands that maybe don't understand getting media coverage as much. But so, I mean, if you're an environmental advocate, you have to try. That's what it comes down to. You can't just give in to the futility and say, well, we can't win, so let's quit fighting. You got to fight in hopes that there's a tipping point somewhere where enough people come around to your point of view that you get these things stopped. Because that's ultimately, politicians care about votes more than anything else. So if enough voters come to them and say, you let this happen, I vote for someone else, then they're not going to let it happen.
Well, and I think, kind of piggybacking off of that, I think Seneca Lake Guardian, who has been leading this fight, this effort, is as well organized as any, I'll call them large. They are a large environmental advocacy group. They have had some big wins.
Right.
Incinerator, gas storage on Seneca. They have had some big wins. But I don't necessarily know that in this case, those wins are anything other than detrimental, because Governor Cuomo has already conceded 2 environmental projects that he probably otherwise would have been able to tout as big wins in a re-election campaign, especially when he needs a big win in the environmental crowd, or the clean energy crowd, because there is obviously the state push to meet a bunch of clean energy goals by 2030 or 2032, whatever it may be. I don't know that. Maybe the region has kind of run out of projects it can say no to for the time being. And maybe this is one of those ones where the region will ultimately end up having to just say, well, I guess this one's going to happen. But the next one, we'll be right back at it with the next one. It seems very interesting to me. And Peter Mantius has waterfrontonline.blog. We run his stories. He's had some really great features in a couple state publications too. On this topic and on the topic of Greenwich. He's been covering them really closely. I understand the concerns, and I don't think this is, as strange as it might sound, I think this is more political than it is anything else. I think this will ultimately be a political decision, And I think take the environmental part of it completely out of the equation, and that's probably where it's going to fall. Honestly,
I think
that's how the decision is going to be made.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think another difficulty that the environmental advocates face here is how do you define the enemy? What the heck is Bitcoin? I still don't know. I mean, I kind of do. And Bitcoin mining, it's like, what is it, and why does somebody want to do it, and what's bad about it? I'm not even sure, to be honest, what's bad about it. Is it that there's going to be warmed water discharged into the lake? Is that the primary complaint, or is the primary complaint that you'll have to generate so much electricity to do it, therefore burning fossil fuels? I mean, it's most people's eyes just glaze over when they hear Bitcoin. It's like, what is it? Why is it worth anything? Why is somebody putting a bunch of computers together, having them guess numbers at random, and if they guess one right, they have this thing that's now worth a bunch of money, except it's worth half what it was 3 weeks ago? So, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I think it's hard to paint your enemy, and it's hard to get a clear picture. What is it you're against? What is it about this that bothers you, other than it sounds bad and we're an environmental group, so that means we should be against it?
Yeah, and that, I think, the chief complaint thus far, the chief concern thus far has been the warming of water in Seneca Lake, which obviously has an ecosystem, has ecosystem consequences. But again, like you said, glazing over, very complicated, very nuanced. There's, I'll say, a smaller crowd. Again, you want to talk about what rural communities are made of. There is a very small group of people who understand in the Finger Lakes what Bitcoin is compared to the population at large. There are probably fewer people here who are invested in Bitcoin as opposed to Rochester, Syracuse, New York City, whatever the case may be. So you definitely, that probably is a factor as well. Going off that, sort of another state-related issue here that has implications. Governor Cuomo is hosting a fundraiser later this month for what many expect to be his re-election campaign. There's the caveat that some of his campaign funds could be used for his legal troubles or his legal expenses with regard to the sexual harassment allegations and nursing home cover-up scandal that he's currently embroiled in. But most signs point to him running again. Polling shows that he'd likely win a comfortable race against a Republican, but a primary, maybe not so much. Maybe the primary is where he could potentially go down if he's going to. The debate. Who is this a worse sign for? Republicans who cannot gain any footing whatsoever in state politics, or Democrats that they could very likely be saddled with Cuomo for another 4 years?
Well, I think it's the former, because I don't think, again, the money and the power structure in this state are downstate. There are more, I'm making this fact up, but I'm pretty sure it's true. There are probably more people who live within 25 miles of Central Park than there are who live in the entire rest of the state. So I don't think Democrats, especially downstate, see this as being saddled with Cuomo. They see a guy, I mean, on social issues, he's been able to get a lot of the left's social priorities enacted. You know, economically, again, if I'm in Westchester County and I'm working in a job making $250,000 a year and I live in a $500,000 house, I got no problems with Andrew Cuomo. I think that's, we see him and we see state government through a whole different lens in this part of the state. And I don't know how you ever fix that. I mean, that's how it was when I was in Massachusetts, East versus West. You've got the Beltway around Boston that has a whole different set of priorities than the people out in the rural, central, and western parts of the state. So, I think he runs again. I think he wins easily. I've had this debate with my co-hosts. I don't think Lee Zeldin has a lot of name recognition, to the average person who doesn't follow politics. Rob Astorino, we know him because he ran before, and he didn't. I mean, he came reasonably close in terms of a Republican. He got like 40% or something. But so I think we're going to get Andrew Cuomo. He's going to run again. I think he's going to skate on all these scandals, because if I'm a Democrat, the question you always face in politics is, what happens if I cross this guy? So nobody's going to oppose him unless they're pretty sure that he's going down. I mean, look at Trump and the Republican Party. Nobody wants to cross Donald Trump because if you bet wrong, your career's on the line. So people go with the winner. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I'm a Democrat downstate and I think he's going to win, then I'm going to support him, because if I don't, he may come after me and pull something out of my district or something, next time around.
Yeah, and I think to that end, one of the things that I thought of this week while I was sort of reflecting on the legislative session in Albany, as we now, I think we're less than a week out from the end, what did Democrats actually get accomplished? And I think, you talk about, marijuana legalization, and, you can kind of point to maybe some of the criminal justice reforms that are potentially going to get across the finish line before the end of the year or end of session. I don't know. For a party that has as much control as the Democrats do in Albany right now, they control all of the government. I don't think they've necessarily gotten as much done as they probably could have if they were more cohesive.
I'm going to take a little bit of exception because you say Democrats control the government. I don't think they do. I think Andrew Cuomo does. It's to me, what symbolizes the legislative session better than anything else was that they just passed a law saying that pharmacists could give COVID vaccinations, which they've been doing all along anyway because the governor said so. So, I mean, the legislature right now is nothing more than a rubber stamp for the governor. And Democrats are okay with that, apparently, and Republicans can howl at the moon all they want, but it's not going to do them any good. They just don't have the numbers. So we have essentially one-man rule in this state. I've never seen anything like it. The budget is whatever the governor says. It includes things that aren't budgetary at all, but are strictly policy wishes. So I think the Democrats just go along because there's no other horse to ride right now. I mean, until he decides he wants to retire, and then there'll maybe be some scramble for power. But right now, he's got it all. And Democrats seem okay with that. They make noises about taking away emergency powers. That hasn't happened now. We're going on 15, 16 months. So I just have to assume that the Democrats are okay with what they've got right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think this is another... we've been talking about all these rural issues, and we've got one more to talk about before the end of the show. And this is probably the dynamic between Governor Cuomo and state lawmakers is probably the biggest barricade that rural upstate New York has to hurdle if it's going to survive in the next 10 years, 10 to 20 years. I'm not saying Cuomo's going to remain in office throughout that time, but I'm saying if he is elected to another term, the damage that is done to rural upstate New York could be more than what rural upstate New York as it was present day or even 10, 20, 30 years ago will probably be permanently in the rearview mirror. And that I think is, it's going to have an impact. Last topic here. There were two interesting stories this week with regard to first responder services in upstate New York. The first involves a task force possibly being created at the state level to evaluate ambulance service in rural parts of New York. The second involves a bill sponsored by Senator Helming to bolster volunteer firefighter recruitment by focusing on young people and giving them the opportunity to shadow and get involved in actual emergency situations in a safe way. Bottom line here is that all of these services, which are clearly critical, are struggling to pull numbers, to maintain, just everything across the board. So the debate, will these measures do any good? And I ask that because a task force typically doesn't result in a lot of change. Or are we headed toward a future of emergency services that simply don't measure up in some communities or have to be paid or are forced to be subsidized in a real way, driving up costs and becoming more expensive and maybe continuing the trend toward lack of viability in some of these small communities?
I think largely the latter. I had Senator Helming on just this week when we were talking about that bill, and it's a step, but I'm not sure that allowing the young people to go out on calls is going to be enough to get them to do this. The big problem that emergency services have been having is that this is very time consuming. The training requirements keep getting ratcheted up, and the pay and the reward is just not worth what you have to go through. So I think at a certain point we're going to have to say, okay, we need to subsidize these services with tax dollars, or create better incentives. There's been talk for years about certain tax breaks or free tuition and those sort of things. I mean, but we're doing that for vaccinations now. Are we going to, you can't cure every problem by handing out a free donut.
I mean, I love that the word service comes with the expectation of there being some sort of exchange, right? Service, exchange. If the only exchange that a volunteer firefighter is getting is maybe the occasional pat on the back and good job, thanks buddy for your service, that's not, that doesn't fall into the traditional category of service, right? I'm not saying people are less selfless or people are more jaded or whatever the case may be, but the circumstances of life dictate that people are working more jobs, they're working longer hours, they're making less money.
Exactly.
And the only way that you increase turnout to these types of volunteer services is you make them not voluntary anymore. And you effectively pay people to do these jobs. They're jobs, right? It's a job to be a firefighter, to be a
or
EMT or whatever the case may be.
Or you pay people better in their regular day-to-day jobs so they feel more comfortable doing this kind of thing. Because like you said, if somebody's holding down 3 jobs, then you haven't got even time to be a volunteer firefighter. I mean, if you're behind the counter at the convenience store, you can't jump up and go fight a fire because your boss will fire you.
Yeah, and I also think it's, I like the intent of Senator Helming's bill. I guess my caution toward it would be, we're pushing kids in that regard toward a field that is literally has no financial future at all under the current circumstance. You can spend your 16 to 18 years, 16, 18-year-old life being a volunteer firefighter or shadowing a volunteer firefighting company, or you could potentially be learning a trade or prepping for college or doing something that's actually going to improve your life post high school, post college, whatever the case may be, and also help fix some of the viability issues that these rural communities are facing. One thing at the expense of another kind of zero sum issue here. I don't know. It's just more complicated than I think simply giving young people the opportunity to shadow firefighters in rural communities. I don't think that's going to fix the problem. I think at the end of the day, you got to pay them.
I think it's a start because maybe it gets them. Maybe it sparks that interest. But yeah, in the long run, I just think there's a kind of especially with this pandemic for all this time now, there's a national sense of, and I've talked to a couple of young people recently, of just being beaten down by the world, their life, and capitalism and work. And I think there's more and more a sense, especially among young people, that at the end of the day, they just want to go home and put their head under a pillow. I mean, they just don't see, even my generation, we were kind of taught you go into the work field, you work 25 years someplace, you move up through the ranks, your salary gets better, you get nicer cars, nicer houses, they give you a gold watch, you retire, and you live happily ever after. Today's young generation doesn't see that path. They see a job where there's no room for growth, where their boss is going to be there for 100 years, and they'll never have that job, and they just don't see the hope. And I think that leads to less things like volunteerism. I mean, people just feel beaten down at the end of the day. It's like, do I want to go help out at the soup kitchen, or do I just want to go home and collapse and get ready for tomorrow? And I think ultimately a lot of people are choosing that.
And that comes with the caveat that, one scenario I could see playing out would be, okay, so employers pay their employees more, but all of a sudden the expectations change. And they're expected to be on the clock 24/7, or they're expected to be at their manager's beck and call nonstop. And, there's just so many ways, like until we really start to reconstruct or deconstruct the culture that we've built in working America, I don't really see a scenario where, things can improve in a meaningful way.
Well,
especially when it comes to volunteering and things you do outside of
There's this great resistance to taxes. I mean, nobody wants taxes to go up, but taxes are the price we pay for services. So if you want a good ambulance service or you want a good fire service, to expect to get that for free, I think, is pretty unrealistic, and it's kind of amazing that we've been able to do it for as long as we have.
It is. Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Auburn, that is 96.3 and 1590 WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 and 1240 WGVA, weekday mornings, 5:30 to 9.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Give Ted a listen Monday through Friday and join us back here next week. We will see you then.